A plane once flew with a cargo hold full of salami until the doors burst open. American aviation history is filled with moments of sheer absurdity that defy all logic. You're about to discover the most unbelievable true stories from the skies, where human error and bizarre coincidence created pure chaos. By the end of this, you will know the secret stories behind the headlines, from a pilot chasing a UFO to a bomb that vanished into the ocean. How did a simple weather balloon trigger a massive anti-aircraft barrage over Los Angeles? What really happened the night a man jumped from a plane with a fortune in cash? What is the most ridiculous flight you have ever been on? That salami explosion pales in comparison to the day Boston was attacked by a sticky, sweet substance from the skies. In the final days of World War I, a young United States Army pilot was on a routine training flight over the city. His mission was simple: to test a new type of practice bomb designed to leave a visible mark on the ground for observers to spot. But this was no ordinary dummy round. Instead of sand or smoke, engineers had filled this particular bomb with a thick, dark, and incredibly viscous liquid, molasses. It was a strange choice, born from the experimental and often chaotic nature of early military aviation, where almost anything seemed worth trying once. The pilot soared over the bustling industrial district, lining up his target, and released the unusual projectile. His aim, however, was tragically off. The bomb did not land in an empty field or a designated target zone. It plummeted straight down, crashing directly through the roof of the Purity Distilling Company. The impact was catastrophic. The force of the hit ruptured a massive storage tank inside the factory, one that was already filled to the brim with millions of gallons of molasses. What happened next was a scene of pure, surreal chaos. A wave of sticky, brown syrup, estimated to be over 25 feet high, exploded outwards from the building. This tidal wave of molasses surged through the streets with terrifying speed and power, smashing buildings, overturning vehicles, and trapping both people and animals in its gooey grasp. The disaster was immediate and baffling. For the people on the ground, it was an incomprehensible event, a sweet-smelling, suffocating nightmare that seemed to come from nowhere. It took days for the full, ridiculous story to emerge, that this wasn't an industrial accident, but the result of a military training exercise gone horribly wrong. The cleanup was a monumental task, with firefighters using salt water from the harbor to wash the streets, a process that took weeks. For years afterwards, people in Boston claimed they could still smell molasses on a hot summer day, a lingering, absurd reminder of the time the sky literally rained trouble. That sticky deluge in Boston was a bizarre accident, but just 2.5 decades later, the entire city of Los Angeles would be gripped by a panic so profound it would lead to a full-scale military engagement against an enemy that did not exist. In the early, tense hours of February 25, 1942, the American West Coast was on a razor's edge. The attack on Pearl Harbor was less than 3 months old, and the fear of a follow-up Japanese strike was a palpable, living thing. Air raid sirens began to wail across Los Angeles shortly after 2 in the morning, casting a blanket of dread over the sleeping metropolis. A total blackout plunged the city into darkness, and then the searchlights snapped on, their brilliant beams cutting through the night to converge on a single, mysterious object floating high in the sky. What the gun crews and civilians saw was unclear, a silvery, slow-moving shape caught in the crossing lights. To the terrified and trigger-happy soldiers manning the anti-aircraft batteries, it could only be one thing: a Japanese reconnaissance plane, or even the vanguard of a full bombing raid. Without a confirmed identification, the order was given to fire. The night then erupted into a deafening, terrifying spectacle. For the next hour, the skies over Los Angeles were filled with the relentless thunder of artillery. Over 1,400 shells were fired into the air, their exploding fragments intended to shred enemy aircraft, but instead falling back to Earth as jagged, hot shrapnel. The shrapnel rained down, damaging homes and cars, and several people died from heart attacks brought on by the sheer stress of the event. Yet after all that expenditure of ammunition and raw terror, not a single enemy aircraft was shot down. In fact, no enemy aircraft were ever there, so what were they shooting at? The most accepted and frankly ridiculous explanation points to a lost weather balloon. A single unarmed meteorological balloon, likely launched by the U.S. Navy itself, had drifted off course and, caught in the powerful searchlights, was mistaken for a dire threat. The entire battle was a case of mass hysteria and tragic misidentification, a multi-million-dollar fireworks display aimed at a piece of scientific equipment. While Los Angeles was recovering from its Phantom Air battle, a very different kind of chaos was brewing high above the American heartland, one that would prove just as ridiculous and far more fragrant. This story begins with the Flying Tiger Line, a cargo carrier known for hauling just about anything, and one particular flight in the late 1940s loaded with a very specific product, thousands of pounds of freshly packed salami. The cargo was sealed tightly in its containers and loaded into the plane's hold, a routine operation for a routine flight, but the pilots and crew had no idea they were carrying a ticking time bomb of fermented meat. As the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude, the atmospheric pressure inside the plane dropped significantly. Inside those sealed containers, the salami began to do what salami naturally does: it continued to ferment. This biological process releases gases, and with the lower outside pressure, those gases expanded with incredible force, building up inside the airtight packages like a shaken soda can. The pressure became so immense that it finally reached a critical point. With a tremendous bang that echoed through the fuselage, the cargo doors could no longer contain the pent-up energy. They burst open violently. In an instant, the plane's cabin became the scene of a truly surreal disaster. A torrent of cured meat erupted from the hold. Salami rockets shot through the interior, while a blizzard of spicy, fermented sausage rained down from the sky onto the unsuspecting countryside below. The pilots were suddenly flying a plane that was not only damaged, but also filled with a chaotic whirlwind of flying meat. They managed to make an emergency landing, but the true scope of the incident was revealed on the ground. For miles around, farmers and townspeople were baffled to find their fields, rooftops, and roads littered with salami. A routine cargo flight had been transformed into an involuntary and bizarre aerial deli drop, a moment of pure, unscripted absurdity that remains one of aviation's most deliciously ridiculous chapters. The airborne salami incident was a bizarre accident, but the skies held a far more tragic form of absurdity, one that would cost a man his life in a futile chase. Just 1 year after the chaos over Los Angeles, a seasoned pilot named Thomas Mantell found himself in the crosshairs of a mystery that would define his legacy. On a clear January afternoon in 1948, air traffic controllers in Kentucky received a flood of frantic calls from the public. People were reporting a gigantic, circular object hovering in the sky, something they described as terrifying and otherworldly. Mantell, a decorated World War II veteran flying with the Kentucky Air National Guard, was leading a flight of 4 F-51 Mustangs when they were asked to investigate. This was no training exercise, it was a real-world scramble to identify a potential threat. Climbing towards the unknown, Mantell radioed back what he saw. He described the object as metallic and tremendous in size, and he was pushing his plane higher and higher to get a better look. His own aircraft, however, was not equipped with oxygen for high-altitude flight. 2 of his wingmen, recognizing the danger, wisely broke off the pursuit and returned to base, but Mantell, determined and perhaps captivated by the enormous thing above him, continued his ascent. He climbed to an altitude far beyond what was safe without supplemental oxygen, chasing a silver speck in the vast blue. Those were his last transmissions. Soon after, his plane plummeted from the sky, crashing into a farm field. The wreckage was scattered across the countryside, and Captain Thomas Mantell was dead. The official investigation into the crash concluded that he had blacked out from a lack of oxygen, a condition known as hypoxia, before his plane went into an uncontrolled dive. But the question lingered for years, haunting the public imagination. What was that colossal object he died chasing? The answer, when it finally emerged, was almost as shocking as the crash itself. The terrifying metallic craft was not an alien spaceship. It was a Skyhook balloon, a massive, secretive U.S. Navy weather balloon made of reflective, silvery plastic. These balloons were enormous, often over 100 feet tall, and they were designed to float at extremely high altitudes to gather atmospheric data. To a pilot without context, straining his eyes against the sun, it would have appeared exactly as Mantell described, a tremendous metallic object. His tragic death became one of the first fatalities ever attributed to the pursuit of an unidentified flying object, a sobering reminder of how easily cutting-edge technology and human courage can collide with devastating and utterly ridiculous consequences. The tragic fate of Thomas Mantell revealed how the vastness of the sky could be an illusion, a dangerous theater where perception failed. This illusion of empty space would soon be shattered in the most dramatic way possible, not by a secret balloon, but by two massive airliners on a perfectly clear day. On the morning of June 30th, 1956, the skies above the Grand Canyon were a picture of perfect serenity. Two propeller-driven airliners, a Trans World Airlines Super Constellation and a United Airlines DC-7, were both on scenic routes, giving their passengers breathtaking views of the natural wonder below. They were flying under what was known as visual flight rules, a system that essentially placed the responsibility for avoiding other aircraft on the pilots themselves. There was no centralized air traffic control monitoring their precise positions in that airspace. The system relied on pilots seeing and being seen, a notion that would prove fatally flawed. Both aircraft requested permission to deviate slightly from their planned routes to give their passengers a better look at the canyon's majestic depths. The controllers, working with limited radar and no authority over aircraft flying under visual rules, approved the requests. Unknowingly, the paths of the two planes began to converge. High above the canyon, in the turbulent thermals rising from the desert heat, the two airliners were on a collision course. The pilots, focused on the scenery and managing their planes in the bumpy air, never saw each other until it was far too late. The TWA plane was climbing while the United plane was descending. They met with catastrophic force. The collision was horrific, shearing off sections of both aircraft. Witnesses on the ground saw a fiery flash and then the terrible silence that followed. Wreckage from the two planes scattered across the canyon walls, and all 128 people on board perished. It was the deadliest commercial aviation disaster in the world at that time. The sheer absurdity was staggering. How could two planes crash into each other in one of the largest, most wide-open spaces on the entire continent? The investigation exposed a system that was hopelessly outdated, a patchwork of rules that had failed to keep pace with the speed and number of aircraft now filling the skies. This single, ridiculous tragedy over a national landmark became the catalyst that America could no longer ignore, forcing the creation of the modern air traffic control system we rely on today. That collision over the Grand Canyon forced a revolution in how we manage our skies, but it did nothing to curb the sheer scale of the new risks being taken. As commercial aviation grew safer, military flights were pushing into far more dangerous territory, carrying a terrifying new kind of cargo. On a frigid night in February 1958, the United States Air Force B-52 Stratofortress was on a routine training mission. Its goal was to prove the viability of a new, round-the-clock nuclear deterrent, a concept that required these massive bombers to be in the air at all times, ready to strike. To stay aloft for such long durations, they needed constant refueling. This particular bomber was flying off the coast of Georgia, maneuvering to connect with KC-135 tanker aircraft in a delicate mid-air dance. The procedure was risky, bringing two enormous planes dangerously close together at high speed. On this night, something went catastrophically wrong. The B-52 pilot misjudged the distance, and the bomber slammed upward into the tanker. The impact was devastating. The tanker exploded in a fireball, killing all four of its crew members. The B-52 itself was torn apart, its wings sheared off, As the crippled bomber began to break up in midair, the pilot gave the order for the crew to eject. But there was one other critical procedure to follow. The plane was carrying a Mark 15 nuclear bomb, a thermonuclear weapon more powerful than the one that fell on Nagasaki. Following emergency protocols, the crew jettisoned the bomb before they jumped, sending the unarmed but fully functional weapon tumbling down towards the dark waters of the Wassail Sound. 3 of the 5 crew members from the B-52 survived the crash. The bomb, however, did not. A massive search and recovery operation was immediately launched. The military scoured the marshy coastline and the murky, shifting seabed for months. They used sonar, divers, and every tool at their disposal. They found pieces of the wrecked aircraft, but the nuclear bomb itself had vanished without a trace. It was simply gone. The official conclusion was that the bomb had sunk deep into the waterlogged mud and sand of the Sound, a quicksand-like environment that swallowed it whole. To this day, that multi-megaton thermonuclear device, a live weapon of immense destructive power, is still out there. It sits somewhere off the coast of Georgia, buried under layers of silt and time, a permanent, absurd, and chilling relic of Cold War anxiety. The government insists the explosive components are safe, that the complex arming sequence was not completed, but the sheer fact remains. A lost nuclear bomb, a city killer, was accidentally dropped on American soil and never recovered, a ridiculous and haunting secret hiding in plain sight. That lost nuclear bomb was a secret the government desperately hoped would stay buried, but just 2 years later, another secret would fall from the sky in the most public and humiliating way possible. The year was 1960 and the Cold War was at its iciest. The United States was desperate for intelligence on Soviet missile capabilities, and to get it, they relied on a technological marvel, the U-2 spy plane. This aircraft was a masterpiece of engineering, capable of flying at altitudes previously thought unreachable, over 70,000 feet. The Americans were confident it flew so high it was effectively invulnerable to Soviet anti-aircraft guns or missiles. On May 1st, a day celebrated as May Day in the Soviet Union, CIA pilot Gary Powers took off on a top-secret mission from Pakistan, his flight path taking him deep into the heart of Soviet territory. For the American intelligence community, it was just another routine spy flight. For the Soviets, it was an intolerable violation of their airspace. As Powers flew over the city of Sverdlovsk, a surface-to-air missile finally found its mark. The U-2 was hit, and Powers, unable to trigger the plane's self-destruct mechanism completely, was forced to eject. He parachuted safely to the ground, where he was immediately captured by Soviet forces. The Americans, unaware that Powers was alive and talking, decided to brazen it out. NASA issued a press release stating that one of its weather research planes, U-2, had gone missing over Turkey. The story was that the pilot had possibly lost consciousness due to an oxygen failure, and his plane had strayed accidentally into Soviet airspace. It was a flimsy cover story, and the Soviets gleefully ripped it to shreds. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev did not reveal his full hand at first. He announced that an American spy plane had been shot down, deliberately letting the Americans dig their own grave. As U.S. officials doubled down on the weather research story, Khrushchev played his trump card. He revealed to the world that they had not only recovered the wreckage of the plane with its sophisticated spy cameras intact, but they also had the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, alive and well. The United States had been caught in an elaborate, bald-faced lie on the global stage. The diplomatic circus that followed was a masterpiece of international embarrassment. A major summit between Khrushchev and President Eisenhower was shattered. Khrushchev stormed out, and the incident set back U.S.-Soviet relations for years. The entire affair was a cascade of ridiculous miscalculations, from the arrogance of believing the plane was untouchable to the clumsy cover story that collapsed the moment the Soviets produced the living, breathing pilot. Gary Powers eventually returned home in a prisoner exchange, but the incident remains a stark, almost comical lesson in what happens when a secret falls from the sky, along with the pilot who was supposed to vanish with it. The U-2 incident was a global humiliation, but it was a meticulously planned operation. The true masterclass in airborne absurdity belongs to a man who acted alone, armed with nothing but a bluff and a briefcase. On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, a passenger aboard Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 gave his name as Dan Cooper. He was a quiet man in a business suit and sunglasses. After the Boeing 727 took off from Portland bound for Seattle, he handed a note to a flight attendant. She initially dismissed it as a pass, but Cooper was insistent. When she finally read it, her blood ran cold. The note claimed he had a bomb in his briefcase and calmly detailed his demands. He wanted $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. Upon landing in Seattle, he would exchange the 36 passengers and most of the crew for the money and the gear. It was a plan of stunning audacity. The authorities scrambled to comply, gathering the ransom money, all in unmarked $20 bills whose serial numbers had been meticulously recorded. In Seattle, the exchange went exactly as Cooper demanded. The passengers left the plane, the money and parachutes were brought aboard, and the jet took off again with only a handful of crew and its one remaining passenger, the man who would become known to the world as D.B. Cooper. His new instructions were specific: fly to Mexico City at a low altitude of 10,000 feet, with the rear staircase lowered and the landing gear retracted. As the plane soared through a rainy, pitch-black night over the rugged forests of the Pacific Northwest, Cooper did the unthinkable. He tied the bag of money to his body, lowered the aircraft's unique rear air stair, and without a word, stepped back into the raging storm. He vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only his clip-on tie and a few cigarette butts. An extensive manhunt involving the FBI and military units found nothing: no body, no parachute, and none of the money. For years, the case remained a complete mystery, the only unsolved air piracy in American history. Then, in 1980, a young boy digging on a riverbank unearthed a rotting package containing nearly $6,000 of the ransom cash. It was the only trace of the fortune ever found. The sheer ridiculousness of the heist is what captivates us. A man with no visible weapon convinced an entire airline and the federal government that he had a bomb, collected a king's ransom, and then leaped from a moving jet into a storm, seemingly disappearing from the face of the earth. Was he a criminal genius who pulled off the perfect crime, or just a lucky fool who met a frozen, anonymous end in the wilderness? The truth is, we will probably never know, and that enduring, baffling mystery is the most ridiculous part of all. D.B. Cooper's leap into the unknown was an act of criminal audacity, but the most perilous flights often begin with a simple, almost laughable mistake. Just over a decade later, an Air Canada Boeing 767 was cruising at 26,000 feet over Red Lake, Ontario, when an ominous warning buzzed in the cockpit. A single chime signaled a problem with the fuel pressure in the left engine. The pilots, both highly experienced, initially thought it was a faulty sensor. Moments later, the alarm was followed by a far more terrifying sound: the shuddering silence as that engine flamed out and stopped completely. Before they could even begin their emergency checklist, a second, deeper shudder ran through the airframe. The right engine had also quit. In an instant, the state-of-the-art jetliner, packed with 61 passengers and crew, had been transformed into the heaviest glider in the world. The problem was not a complex mechanical failure or a sudden storm. It was math. The plane was brand new, and Canada was in the process of switching to the metric system. This particular aircraft measured its fuel in liters and kilograms, while the older fleet used pounds. The ground crew in Montreal had mistakenly calculated the fuel load using the wrong conversion factor. They believed they had loaded 20,000 kilograms of fuel, more than enough for the flight to Edmonton. In reality, they had only loaded 20,000 pounds, which is less than half the required amount. The pilots, relying on the fuel gauges that were inoperative due to a separate electrical fault, had no way of knowing they were essentially flying on fumes. They were now in a silent, powerless jet, desperately searching for a place to land in a vast, sparsely populated landscape. The captain, Robert Pearson, was an experienced glider pilot in his spare time, a skill that was about to become the only thing standing between everyone on board and catastrophe. He calculated their glide slope, aiming for the former Royal Canadian Air Force base at Gimli, a decommissioned strip he remembered from his military days. What he did not know was that the old base had been converted into a public park, and a busy drag racing track was now active on the main runway. As the enormous jet descended silently from the sky, people below looked up in confusion, then in horror, as the airliner lined up for its approach. Pearson realized he was coming in too high and too fast. He performed a dangerous, never-before-attempted maneuver in a commercial jet, a sideslip, banking the aircraft while using the rudder to create drag and shed altitude. It was a stunt straight out of a glider handbook applied to a 200-ton airliner. The plane touched down hard on the decommissioned runway, its nose wheel strut collapsing from the impact. It screeched along the concrete, throwing up a shower of sparks, and skidded to a halt just feet away from a crowd of terrified families and race enthusiasts who had scattered for their lives. Miraculously, only a handful of people suffered minor injuries during the evacuation. The Gimli glider, as it became famously known, was a monument to pilots' skill and sheer luck, but its near disaster was born from a moment of pure, ridiculous human error, a simple metric miscalculation that turned a routine flight into a desperate fight for survival. The Gimli glider was saved by a pilot's incredible skill, but sometimes the aircraft itself has to endure the impossible. Just 5 years later, an Aloha Airlines flight would face a catastrophe that should have been unsurvivable. It was a routine island hopper, a short 20-minute flight from Hilo to Honolulu in Hawaii. The plane, a Boeing 737, had spent its entire life on these quick hops, constantly cycling through takeoffs and landings in the salty, humid island air. With each pressurization and depressurization cycle, tiny, invisible stress cracks were slowly growing in the metal skin of the fuselage. On April 28, 1988, as the plane climbed through 24,000 feet, those cracks reached their breaking point. With a sound like a massive gunshot, a huge section of the roof at the front of the passenger cabin simply tore away. The sky exploded into the plane. In an instant, the jet was transformed into a screaming, open-aired convertible traveling at over 300 miles per hour. The explosive decompression ripped the cockpit door away and sucked the chief flight attendant straight out of the aircraft. She vanished into the blue void. Passengers sat frozen in terror, staring at the open sky where the ceiling had been, their seatbelts the only thing keeping them from being pulled into the abyss. Debris and luggage swirled in the violent wind. The pilots, struggling to hear each other over the roar, fought for control. The plane was shaking violently, its nose dipping and rising. They had no idea how much of the plane was even left. Miraculously, the two wing engines were still running and the basic controls responded. The captain, Robert Skornsthamer, a former crop duster with nerves of steel, began a desperate, gradual descent towards the nearest airport on Maui. He had no instruments for his airspeed or altitude as the systems were destroyed. He flew by instinct and the feel of the aircraft, a damaged bird struggling to stay in the air. As they approached the runway, the crew could see fire trucks and emergency vehicles already lining the tarmac, a sight that did little to inspire confidence. The landing was tense but perfect. As the plane rolled to a stop, the true extent of the damage became horrifyingly clear. Nearly the entire top half of the fuselage, from just behind the cockpit to the front of the wings, was gone. The ridiculous and terrifying cause was metal fatigue. The countless small cycles of stress had created a weakness that maintenance checks had completely failed to detect. The adhesive that bonded the metal skin panels together had degraded, allowing cracks to spread undetected beneath the surface. It was a plane that, on the outside, looked perfectly airworthy, but was secretly coming apart at the seams. That this shattered aircraft managed to land at all was a miracle of engineering and piloting, but the fact that it ever got to that point was a breathtaking failure of oversight, a reminder that sometimes the most routine flight is hiding a ridiculous and deadly secret. Even the shattered fuselage of Aloha Airlines seems almost understandable compared to a crisis born from pure foolishness. One moment, you are cruising peacefully at 33,000 feet, and the next, the world drops out from under you. That is exactly what happened aboard U.S. Airways Flight 277 from Chicago to Pittsburgh in the summer of 1995. The Boeing 737 was on final approach, a routine end to a routine journey. Then, without any warning, the roar of the engines vanished. A sudden, profound silence filled the cabin, broken only by the rush of air outside. The plane's nose tipped downward, and the aircraft began a sickening plunge toward the ground. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swinging wildly as the jet lost altitude. Passengers screamed, convinced they were moments from death. In the cockpit, however, the situation was even more bizarre. This was not a mechanical failure or a sudden storm. The first officer, as a joke, had suddenly pulled both engine thrust levers back to idle, simulating a complete dual-engine failure. He had done it without a word of warning to the captain, the flight attendants, or the dozens of people in the back. The plane fell thousands of feet in a matter of seconds, a terrifying roller coaster drop that felt like an eternity. The captain, utterly shocked, immediately wrested control back, shoving the throttles forward to restart the engines and pull the aircraft out of its dive. The entire event lasted less than a minute, but the psychological damage was done. The first officer reportedly laughed, treating the whole incident as a hilarious prank. But for everyone else on board, it was a traumatic brush with catastrophe, a moment of sheer terror manufactured for one man's amusement. The aftermath was swift and severe. While the pilots managed to land the plane safely in Pittsburgh, the airline and the Federal Aviation Administration launched an immediate investigation. The first officer's career was over the moment he decided to play his joke. He was fired, his pilot's license was revoked, and he faced federal charges for his actions. The ridiculous breach of professionalism was staggering. This was not a simple error in judgment, it was a deliberate act that put every single life on that aircraft at risk for a moment of what he considered humor. It exposed a terrifying vulnerability, the fact that the sophisticated safety protocols of modern aviation are utterly dependent on the basic sanity and discipline of the people in the cockpit. One person's idea of a prank could, in an instant, undo decades of safety engineering and turn a routine flight into a nightmare. That terrifying plunge over Pittsburgh was a manufactured crisis, a joke that exploited the very real vulnerabilities of flight. But sometimes the greatest danger is not a mechanical failure or a foolish prank, but a simple, insidious trick of the human mind. On a hazy July evening in 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife Carolyn, and her sister Lauren boarded his small, single-engine plane at a New Jersey airport. Their destination was Martha's Vineyard, a short flight over the dark waters of the Atlantic. Kennedy was not an inexperienced pilot. He held his license and had logged over 300 hours in the air. But he was not instrument-rated, meaning he was only qualified to fly by visual reference to the horizon, not relying on his cockpit instruments to navigate. The weather that night was deceptively treacherous. A thick haze layer hung over the ocean, blending the water and the sky into a single, featureless void. This is the perfect condition for a phenomenon known as spatial disorientation, a sensory illusion that has claimed countless lives. As Kennedy's plane climbed out over the water and turned east, he would have flown straight into this visual trap. His body was telling him one thing while his instruments were telling him another. Without a clear horizon, the human vestibular system, the fluid in our inner ears that tells us which way is up, becomes completely unreliable. A gentle, unnoticed bank can feel like level flight. A gradual descent can feel like you are flying straight and true. The pilot, convinced their senses are correct, begins to make corrections that only steepen the turn or push the nose down further, entering a deadly spiral without ever realizing it. This is what investigators believe happened to Kennedy. His plane, a sophisticated aircraft in perfect working order, began a slow, spiraling descent. He likely never saw the water coming. The final radar returns showed the plane dropping at a rate of nearly 5,000 feet per minute, a silent, controlled flight directly into the ocean. The tragedy was not the result of a dramatic engine failure or a violent storm. It was a quiet, almost ridiculous failure of perception where the sky and sea became an indistinguishable graveyard. For a pilot flying on a clear day, the horizon is a trusted guide, but on that hazy night, it vanished, proving that the most dangerous thing in the sky can sometimes be nothing at all. Spatial disorientation is a silent killer, but the next threat to emerge would be loud, clumsy, and leave a permanent mark on every air traveler's daily routine. Just 3 years after the Kennedy tragedy on December 22, 2001, a man named Richard Reed boarded American Airlines Flight 63 in Paris, bound for Miami. He was a hulking, disheveled figure, and his behavior was bizarre from the start. He had paid for his ticket in cash and had no luggage, but his shoes, heavy hiking boots, looked oddly new and thick-soled. Fellow passengers noticed him fidgeting nervously, and he even tried to light a match, which a flight attendant swiftly told him was prohibited. This should have been the moment the entire plot unraveled, but the plane continued on its way. Reed's plan was as simple as it was absurd. He had packed a powerful plastic explosive known as petin into the hollowed-out soles of his shoes with a simple, homemade fuse made from a matchbook and a piece of wire. His entire strategy hinged on lighting that fuse with a single match. Hours into the flight, as the cabin lights were dimmed, he made his move. He pulled out his matches and tried to light his sneaker right there in his seat. The sulfurous smell of a burning match immediately caught the attention of a flight attendant, who rushed over and demanded to know what he was doing. Reed responded by shoving her, and then, in a scene of pure chaos, he attempted to light the fuse a second time. This was not a sophisticated, remote detonation. It was a man in the middle of a passenger cabin trying to set his own shoe on fire. The absurdity of the method, however, did nothing to lessen the danger. The explosive in his shoes was powerful enough to blow a hole in the fuselage. Passengers and crew did not hesitate. They swarmed him, with one man grabbing Reed in a headlock while others doused him with water and used whatever they could find, including plastic handcuffs and even the belt from a flight attendant's uniform, to restrain the struggling would-be terrorist. They pinned him to the floor for the remainder of the flight, with some passengers injecting him with sedatives from the plane's emergency medical kit. The plane was diverted to Boston, where Reed was arrested. The investigation revealed the stunning vulnerability his plot had exposed. Security screenings at the time focused on carry-on bags and metal objects, but no one was looking at footwear. In a single ridiculous act, Richard Reed had turned every pair of shoes into a potential security risk. The response was swift and universal. Within months, the Transportation Security Administration made it mandatory for all passengers to remove their shoes for X-ray screening, a ritual of minor inconvenience now endured by millions of people every single day. A failed attack, foiled by a vigilant flight attendant and the smell of a match, forever changed how we prepare to fly, a lasting legacy of one man's utterly clumsy and ridiculous ambition. The debate over a pilot's ability to land a powerless jet was not just theoretical. It was thrust into the national spotlight on a bitterly cold January afternoon in 2009. U.S. Airways Flight 1549 had just taken off from New York's LaGuardia Airport when it flew straight into a massive flock of Canada geese. The dual bird strike was catastrophic, immediately disabling both of the Airbus A320's engines. The roar of the jets was replaced by an eerie, profound silence. Captain Chesley Sullenberger, a calm and veteran pilot, took in the situation with stunning clarity. He was gliding a massive airliner with 155 souls on board over one of the most densely populated urban landscapes on Earth. His options were vanishingly few. Air traffic controllers frantically tried to guide him back to LaGuardia or to a nearby airport in New Jersey, but Sully knew instantly, with the gut instinct of an experienced aviator, that they would never make it. The plane was too low, too slow, and too heavy. He made a decision that seemed impossible. "We are going to be in the Hudson," he radioed, his voice utterly calm. He guided the silent 150-ton aircraft in a gentle, sweeping turn, lining it up with the frigid, gray river. He had to keep the wings perfectly level and the nose at just the right angle. A single mistake would cause the plane to cartwheel and break apart on impact. With breathtaking precision, he settled the jet onto the water's surface. It was a controlled crash, a masterpiece of airmanship that came to be known as the Miracle on the Hudson. Every person on board survived, rescued by a flotilla of ferries and emergency boats. Captain Sullenberger was hailed as a national hero, a title he unquestionably deserved, yet in a twist of pure bureaucratic absurdity, that heroism was almost immediately questioned. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board ran computer simulations of the event. Their models, fed with perfect data and flown by pilots who knew exactly what was about to happen, suggested that the Airbus could have made it safely back to LaGuardia. The implication was subtle but damning. Had Sully made the wrong choice? Had his miracle been an unnecessary risk? The public was outraged. How could a computer simulation, devoid of human reaction time and real-world terror, second-guess the man who had saved everyone? The debate completely missed the point. Sully and his co-pilot, Jeffrey Skiles, had to process the chaos, diagnose the problem, and make a life-or-death decision in a matter of seconds. The simulations gave test pilots multiple tries with foreknowledge. When investigators finally included a realistic 35-second delay for human decision-making in their models, every single attempt to reach an airport ended in disaster. The plane would have crashed into buildings or neighborhoods with catastrophic loss of life. The entire controversy was a ridiculous exercise in armchair quarterbacking, a stark reminder that no computer model can ever fully capture the split-second grace under pressure that defines true heroism. The Miracle on the Hudson instantly transformed from a news story into a modern American folk tale. Captain Chesley Sullenberger, or Sully as the world came to know him, was no longer just a pilot. He was an archetype of quiet competence in a noisy world. His face was everywhere, from the cover of Time magazine to a guest spot on Saturday Night Live, where he was portrayed with a serene, unflappable calm that perfectly captured the public's admiration. The event itself was so perfectly cinematic, so laden with symbolic weight, that it was almost begging to be parodied. Late-night comedians could not resist. Jokes about geese applying for hazardous duty pay and airlines offering swimming lessons as part of pre-flight safety demonstrations became standard fare. The plane's gentle landing was reenacted with everything from toy boats in bathtubs to slices of bread floating in soup, reducing a life or death drama into a clip for viral laughs. This was the bizarre cultural spiral where profound heroism and genuine trauma were processed through the relentless and often ridiculous machine of pop culture. Even the term bird strike, once a technical phrase known only to aviation engineers and pilots, was suddenly on everyone's lips. It entered the common vocabulary, a reminder of how a seemingly minor natural occurrence could bring a multimillion-dollar machine to a shuddering halt. The incident had all the elements of a perfect story: an underdog, a clear villain in the form of a flock of birds, and a triumphant, against all odds ending. But this cultural digestion came with a strange side effect. It risked sanding down the raw, terrifying edges of the event, turning a desperate, skill-fueled emergency into a comfortable, almost predictable narrative of American ingenuity. We celebrated the miracle so much that we almost forgot the sheer, ridiculous improbability of it all, that the safety of a packed airliner could hinge on a chance encounter with a few dozen birds and the unshakable nerve of one man in the cockpit. The underwear bomber's clumsy attempt was a testament to just how ridiculous the security theater had become. Just 1 year after the Miracle on the Hudson, on Christmas Day 2009, a 23-year-old man named Umer Farrokh Abdelmutalab boarded Northwest Airlines Flight 253 from Amsterdam to Detroit. He had paid for his ticket in cash and checked no luggage. More alarmingly, his father, a prominent Nigerian banker, had actually contacted the U.S. Embassy months earlier to warn them that his son had fallen under the influence of radical extremists. His name was in a government database, yet he was not on any no-fly list. The system, designed to connect dots, had failed to draw a single line. Abdulmutalab's plot was as crude as it was desperate. He had sewn a powerful plastic explosive known as petin into the lining of his underwear with a simple syringe filled with liquid acid intended to act as a chemical fuse. The entire device was a volatile, homemade contraption that was as likely to injure its user as anyone else. Mid-flight, as the plane began its descent into Detroit, he retreated to the bathroom for 20 minutes to prepare the device. He returned to his seat, covered himself with a blanket, and then attempted to inject the syringe to trigger the explosion. There was no sophisticated timer, no remote control. The plan hinged on a man stabbing a bag of chemicals sewn into his own pants. Instead of a catastrophic blast, there was a series of small pops, followed by smoke and flames. The explosive had fizzled, burning Abdulmutalab's own groin and leg rather than tearing through the fuselage. A quick-thinking passenger smelled the acrid smoke and saw the flames, pouncing on him and alerting the crew. They subdued the would-be bomber and used fire extinguishers to put out the smoldering remains of his underwear. The sheer absurdity was staggering. A man had nearly brought down a jet using a weapon that security screeners were not even trained to look for, hidden in the most intimate and unsearchable place imaginable. The aftermath was a new era of invasive security for every traveler. The full-body scanner, which could see through clothing, became a common and controversial sight in airports worldwide. The enhanced pat-down, a thorough and often embarrassing physical search, became a standard procedure for anyone who opted out of the scanner or triggered an alarm. A single failed and utterly ridiculous plot, foiled more by its own shoddy construction than by any security protocol, had ushered in a new normal where privacy was routinely traded for the illusion of safety, all because one man tried to light his pants on fire. The underwear bomber's fiasco highlighted a security system struggling to catch up, but in the cockpit, a different kind of dependency was creating a far more complex danger. On a clear summer afternoon in July 2013, Asiana Airlines Flight 214 was on final approach to San Francisco International Airport. The massive Boeing 777 was packed with over 300 people, and the pilots were at the controls of one of the most automated aircraft ever built. For the crew, this was supposed to be a routine landing, but their over-reliance on the plane's sophisticated computers set the stage for a cascade of ridiculous errors. The pilots intended to use the automated landing system, but they had misunderstood a critical detail. They believed the autothrottle was actively maintaining their approach speed, a function they had come to expect from the machine. In reality, the system was in a different mode, one that required the pilots to manually control their airspeed. No alarm sounded to warn them. The plane, left to its own momentum, began to slow down, drifting well below the safe speed for landing. It was sinking slowly, silently, toward the runway. Inside the cockpit, the crew was strangely complacent. They discussed the weather and the view, seemingly unaware that their aircraft was bleeding off the energy it needed to stay in the air. It was not until the very last moments, with the runway looming just ahead, that one of the pilots finally noticed how low and slow they had become. He called out for a go-round, for full power to abort the landing and climb away. It was far too late. The plane's tail section smashed into the seawall at the edge of the runway with a sickening crunch. The fuselage cartwheeled and spun down the tarmac, tearing apart and scattering wreckage. Miraculously, most of the passengers and crew survived the initial impact, but the chaotic aftermath claimed 3 lives. The investigation revealed a cockpit culture paralyzed by automation. These were experienced pilots, but they had become so accustomed to the computer managing the flight that they had stopped actively flying the plane. They were monitoring systems instead of the sky, trusting the silent screens more than their own instincts and basic airmanship. The sheer absurdity was breathtaking. A state-of-the-art airliner, packed with redundant safety systems, was flown into the ground because the highly trained professionals in the cockpit were confused by the very technology designed to keep them safe. It was a ridiculous, tragic reminder that no amount of silicon intelligence can replace the fundamental need for a human being at the controls who is actually, actively flying. Automation had lulled pilots into a dangerous complacency, but a new threat was rising from the ground, one piloted by anyone with a credit card and a disregard for the rules. The early 2010s saw consumer drones explode in popularity, transforming from expensive novelties into affordable toys available at every big box store. Suddenly, the skies were filled with a buzzing, chaotic swarm of these small, agile devices, flown by amateurs who often had no concept of the dangers they posed. The rules were vague, the enforcement was nearly non-existent, and the potential for catastrophe grew with every birthday present unwrapped. This new era of aerial absurdity reached a terrifying climax in the summer of 2014. A U.S. Airways shuttle flight was on its final approach to New York's JFK Airport, descending through 1,000 feet when the pilots spotted it. A small, black, unmanned drone was flying directly in their path. It was not a bird, it was a man-made object, and it passed so close to the airliner's nose that the crew felt they could have reached out and touched it. The distance was later estimated to be a mere few dozen feet, a hair's breadth in aviation terms. At that speed and altitude, a collision would have been devastating. A drone sucked into a jet engine would not simply bounce off, it would behave like a piece of shrapnel, potentially destroying the turbine and causing a catastrophic loss of power. The incident sent a shockwave of panic through the Federal Aviation Administration and the airline industry. Here was a threat that their entire security apparatus was not designed to handle. You could not put a drone through a metal detector or subject its pilot to a pat-down. The danger was not a bomb or a hijacker, but a clueless hobbyist in a park, blissfully unaware that their $200 quadcopter was moments away from downing a multi-million-dollar jet filled with people. The regulatory debates that followed were frantic and often ridiculous. How do you track something so small and fast? How do you prove who was flying it? Proposed solutions ranged from creating digital fences around airports using GPS technology to requiring all drones to broadcast an identifying signal, like a digital license plate. The skies, once the exclusive domain of highly trained professionals, had been invaded by a fleet of unlicensed, unregulated, and often unthinking pilots, turning every final approach into a potential game of chicken with a toy. The skies had become a chaotic mix of automated jets and rogue drones, but the most terrifying threats were still the ones hiding in plain sight, inside the very machines we trusted. On April 17, 2018, Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 was cruising at 32,000 feet over Pennsylvania. The flight from New York to Dallas was utterly routine, a packed Boeing 737 filled with people heading home or on business. Then, without any warning, the left engine exploded. The sound was deafening, a violent roar of tearing metal that shook the entire airframe. A fan blade inside the engine had snapped off, triggering a catastrophic failure. The force of the explosion sent shrapnel ripping through the fuselage. It struck a window, shattering it completely. The cabin depressurized in an instant. The air, screaming out of the hole at hundreds of miles per hour, created a violent suction. A passenger sitting by the window was partially pulled out of the aircraft. For agonizing moments, she was exposed to the freezing, thin air and the brutal force of the slipstream, held in her seat only by her seatbelt and the desperate grips of fellow passengers who fought against the unimaginable pull to haul her back inside. The scene inside the cabin was one of pure chaos and horror, a nightmare unfolding at 500 miles per hour. Yet in the cockpit, the response was a masterclass in calm professionalism. The pilots, Tammy Jo Schultz and Darren Elizer, immediately donned their oxygen masks. Captain Schultz, a former Navy fighter pilot, took control with a steady hand. She communicated with air traffic control in a voice so unnervingly calm it became the stuff of legend, declaring they had an injured passenger and needed to descend immediately. She guided the crippled, shaking jet to an emergency landing in Philadelphia, saving the lives of everyone else on board. The tragedy was profound and the heroism undeniable. But the incident also exposed a layer of pure, ridiculous negligence. The engine that failed was a CFM56, one of the most common jet engines in the world. And this was not the first time. The specific model had a known and documented history of fan blade failures. A similar incident had occurred on another Southwest flight back in 2016. The manufacturer and the airline were aware of the risk, a fatal design flaw lurking inside thousands of engines. The problem was linked to metal fatigue in the fan blades, a weakness that developed over thousands of flight cycles. Inspections were supposed to catch these cracks before they could cause a disaster, but the methods in use were clearly not sufficient. The very technology designed to keep us safe was, in this case, a ticking time bomb that the industry had already heard ticking, yet failed to diffuse with the urgency it demanded. A single piece of spinning metal, a flaw everyone knew about, had turned a routine Tuesday into a fight for survival, proving that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the sky is not a mystery at all, but a mistake we have already made. That hidden flaw in a trusted engine was a known danger, but the most devastating failures are the ones engineered into the plane's very brain. The Boeing 737 MAX was meant to be a marvel of modern efficiency, a simple upgrade to a classic airframe that would save airlines fuel and keep Boeing competitive. To achieve this, Boeing fitted the plane with larger, more powerful engines. Their placement on the wing, however, changed the aircraft's handling in a subtle but critical way, making it more prone to pitching its nose up in certain flight conditions. The solution was a software patch, an automated system called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. Its purpose was simple and, on paper, sensible. If a single sensor detected the nose was too high, MCAS would automatically activate, pushing the nose down to prevent an aerodynamic stall. It was a silent guardian, a line of code intended to operate in the background, so minor that Boeing argued it did not require extensive new pilot training. This single decision would have catastrophic consequences. The system's design was fatally flawed. It relied on just one angle of attack sensor, a small vane on the fuselage that measures the plane's angle against the oncoming wind. If that single sensor failed, it could send corrupted data to the flight computer, tricking it into believing the plane was about to stall when it was flying perfectly level. MCAS would then kick in with terrifying force, repeatedly commanding the plane's horizontal stabilizer to push the nose down. The pilots, completely unaware this new system even existed, would find themselves in a desperate, confusing battle against their own aircraft. This exact scenario played out in the cockpits of Lion Air Flight 610 in October 2018 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 just 5 months later. The crews fought valiantly against the automated commands, struggling to understand why their planes were diving relentlessly toward the ground. They followed every procedure they knew, but they were fighting an enemy they had never been told about. Both planes crashed, killing all 346 people on board. The sheer absurdity of the tragedy was staggering. A system designed to save the plane was instead sealing its doom, and the people in control were left in the dark. Boeing's initial response compounded the disaster, downplaying the system's significance and insisting the planes were safe to fly. It was a breathtaking failure of transparency, where corporate pride seemed to outweigh human life. The global grounding of the entire 737 MAX fleet that followed in March 2019 was an unprecedented admission that the very logic of modern aviation had been compromised. How could a multi-billion-dollar company build a secret pilot into its most popular jet, one that could be fooled by a single faulty sensor, and not think to tell the people actually flying the plane? It was a ridiculous, heartbreaking lesson in how the pursuit of profit and simplicity can engineer a flaw more dangerous than any mechanical part. The Boeing MAX crisis revealed a system failing under its own complexity, but a far more visible absurdity was about to unfold across the entire global aviation network. When the COVID-19 pandemic brought the world to a standstill, a strange new category of flight began appearing on radar screens. These were the ghost flights, jets that took off and landed with almost no one on board. While borders closed and passengers stayed home, airlines were compelled to operate thousands of these near-empty journeys, not for any practical travel need, but to satisfy a bizarre and inflexible set of regulations. The rule was simple and ruthless: to keep their valuable landing and takeoff slots at major airports like Heathrow and JFK, an airline had to use them at least 80% of the time. This system, known as use it or lose it, was designed to foster competition in a crowded sky, preventing one carrier from hoarding prime-time slots they did not actually need. In a normal world, it made a certain kind of business sense, but the world had stopped being normal. The rule was not suspended, even as global travel demand evaporated. The result was a spectacle of surreal waste. Airlines faced a ridiculous choice. They could cancel flights that no one wanted to book and permanently forfeit their hard-won slots to competitors, crippling their future business. Or they could fly the planes anyway, burning millions of gallons of jet fuel to carry a handful of passengers, or in many cases, no passengers at all, just a minimal crew. For months, the skies were filled with these spectral airliners, flying purely to satisfy a line in a regulatory handbook. It was a global environmental and economic farce, a policy that prioritized bureaucratic procedure over basic logic during a global health crisis. The roaring engines of a near-empty 747 flying from London to New York were a monument to a system that had lost its mind, a ridiculous waste on a scale so vast it became almost impossible to comprehend. Even as ghost flights haunted empty airports, a different kind of chaos was brewing inside the cabins of the planes that were actually full. The year 2021 saw a terrifying transformation of the friendly skies, as pandemic stress and simmering tensions boiled over into an epidemic of pure air rage. The simple act of wearing a mask became a flashpoint for incidents of shocking absurdity and violence. In one infamous case, a passenger on a Southwest flight grew so enraged over the mask policy that she punched a flight attendant in the face, breaking 2 of her teeth. The confrontation was so severe the flight had to be diverted, and the assailant was met by police on the tarmac. But the madness was not confined to mask disputes. On an American Airlines flight, a man attempted to open the main cabin door and stab a flight attendant with a broken coffee pot after being told he could not buy alcohol because he was not wearing a mask. The sheer irrationality was staggering, a violent outburst over a minor inconvenience that put hundreds of lives at risk. The confined space of the cabin seemed to amplify every petty grievance. Another passenger was recorded on a viral video assaulting a woman in the row behind him, all because she had dared to recline her seat. He screamed and punched her headrest repeatedly, a tantrum born from a complete loss of composure at 30,000 feet. The Federal Aviation Administration, which had typically handled a handful of unruly passenger cases each year, was suddenly inundated. They received thousands of reports and initiated a record number of investigations, levying millions of dollars in fines against passengers who assaulted crew, refused to comply with safety instructions, or simply lost their minds. Airlines responded by creating massive no-fly lists, banning these disruptive passengers for years, sometimes for life. The friendly skies had become a pressure cooker where the simple rules of civility were discarded, revealing a ridiculous and dark side of human nature that no amount of security screening could ever hope to contain. That descent into airborne chaos was not a temporary spike, but a symptom of a much deeper problem festering inside the pressurized cabin. Psychologists point to a toxic cocktail of factors that transform a routine flight into a trigger for rage. The modern flying experience is a masterclass in stress, from the invasive security checks to the cramped seats and the constant pressure of being surrounded by strangers in a confined, inescapable space. Add in the potent mix of alcohol, the anxiety of travel, and the simmering social tensions of the past few years, and you have a perfect storm for irrational behavior. Who are the people who snap? They are not typically hardened criminals. The profile is often someone with a pre-existing sense of entitlement, a low frustration tolerance, and sometimes an underlying fear of flying that manifests as aggression. They are individuals who feel the normal rules of society no longer apply at 35,000 feet, where the authority of a flight attendant can feel like a personal challenge to their autonomy. The response from authorities has been a dramatic escalation. The Federal Aviation Administration, once a relatively quiet regulatory body, now pursues fines with unprecedented zeal, levying penalties that can reach tens of thousands of dollars for a single incident. Airlines have created massive, shared no-fly lists, effectively exiling the worst offenders from commercial air travel for years, sometimes for life. To maintain order, the presence of air marshals has become more common, turning ordinary flights into potential law enforcement operations. Flight crews now receive extensive de-escalation training, learning to spot the early signs of a meltdown before it erupts into violence. Cabin crews are essentially being asked to double as psychologists and bouncers, all while serving drinks and demonstrating the safety features. The sheer ridiculousness of this new reality is that we have reached a point where the people responsible for your safety in an emergency are now also tasked with preventing a passenger from attacking them over a bag of pretzels or a reclined seat. The friendly skies have been fundamentally altered, not by terrorism or mechanical failure, but by a baffling wave of pure, unadulterated human pettiness. From ghost flights burning fuel over empty cities to passengers brawling over reclined seats, our journey through the clouds reveals a simple truth. The history of American aviation is not just a story of engineering triumphs, but a long, strange parade of human error, technological hubris, and moments of pure, unscripted absurdity. We have seen how a single lost weather balloon could convince an entire city it was under attack, and how a simple math mistake could turn a state-of-the-art jet into a clumsy glider. We have watched as secret spy planes fell from the sky, live nuclear bombs vanished into swamps, and one man tried to bring down a jet by lighting his own pants on fire. Each of these ridiculous moments, from the sticky disaster in Boston to the automated nosedive of the 737 MAX, has served as a brutal, often expensive, lesson. They have forced us to build better systems, to question our own assumptions, and to remember that even in the most controlled environments, chaos is always waiting for its chance to take flight. These stories are more than just bizarre footnotes. They are the growing pains of an industry that dared to conquer the sky, a reminder that progress is often paved with hilarious and sometimes heartbreaking mistakes. So, what is the most unbelievable flight story you have ever heard? Was it a strange delay, a bizarre in-flight incident, or a family legend that sounds too wild to be true? Share your own favorite tales of aerial absurdity in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed this wild ride through history, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the incredible stories that shape our world.